Hi guys, and welcome back to History Revision Success. So we are looking at our thematic question of how effective was the Nazi economic policy? How far did Hitler meet his aims? How far did they achieve a economically viable state? Okay, and we've previously looked at that initial period under Schacht from 1933 to 1936. We call recovery. We've looked at how to approach the question in general, and we're now going to look at the period from 1936 to 1939, and we call this rearmament. So 1936 was a turning point in Nazi economic history. Schacht measures had succeeded in reviving the German economy and reducing unemployment. Confidence had been restored and unemployment had been reduced to 1.6 million, which is really quite an incredible feat. However, it had also created a host of problems. Schacht had initially accepted the need for a large increase in public expenditure to reflate the economy and finance rearmament. However, he's becoming increasingly concerned at the distortion of the economy because of rearmament. Now, budget deficits was starting to cause severe strain, and Hitler was also becoming very frustrated with Schacht's caution and wanted to speed up the process of rearmament despite Schacht's worries. So Schacht is getting worried at the fact they're spending more than they have, which is his policy of financial being in a deficit. However, he's worried that they're spending too much, whereas Hitler just wants to keep going more and more and more. So we're going to have a clash. Now, there is also a shortage of foreign exchange, so foreign money, as well as food, along with rising prices and lower living standards for ordinary Germans. This is creating growing disillusionment with the regime. Now, I'm doing a video all about impact on ordinary people. So living standards, wages, prices, things like that. So go and watch that for detail on this kind of idea. Now, the problem with all of this is, as I previously said, the economic policy and making the economic situation better is all about confidence. And it's very, very hard to convince ordinary German people that the economy is better, they should be investing their money, if actually their living standards have dropped. And what this leads to is this major, major issue of prioritization, which has become an issue. Was rearmament worth sacrificing the rest of the economy for? The problem meant that there was a decision to be made over the regime's priorities. Food shortages could be solved through imports, but this would use up the valuable reserves of foreign currency also needed for the import of raw materials. This conflict is often known as guns or butter. Now, the resolution was to strive for self-sufficiency, which we call economic autokey. Increasing the home production of food and raw materials would, in theory, reduce the dependency on imports and the need for large reserves of foreign currency. So if we can grow this ourselves, or if we can create this ourselves, we don't need to be spending our money by importing it from elsewhere. If we can grow all the food we need, if we can create all the raw materials that we need on our soil, we don't need to buy it from other people, and therefore we have resolved the problem. And that's the kind of mindset that Hitler took at this point. Now, this was the basis, really, of the new four-year plan introduced in 1936. Schacht opposed this and was therefore marginalized, with responsibility given instead to Hermann Göring. And that leads us to the four-year plan. So, the four-year plan. The aim was to make Germany ready for war in 4 years. A future war was always implicit in the Nazi quest for Lebensraum, which means living space, in the East. However, this was the very first indication and kind of explicit reference that the regime was gearing for war. The priorities were rearmament and economic autokey, okay? So they're going to try and achieve rearmament and economic autokey, which is self-sufficiency. The methods. So, first of all, they wanted to create a managed economy with controls on labor supply, prices, raw materials, and foreign exchange. So much of what we've already seen, but being extended. We're controlling prices, we're controlling wages, we're telling you what you're allowed to pay people, we're telling you what you're allowed to charge. We are kind of in control of this bigger picture. They also produced targets for private companies, and they established new state-owned industrial plants, such as the Hermann Göring Steelworks, that I'm going to go into more detail later. They increased production of key commodities, such as iron, steel, and chemicals, and they encouraged research and investment in the production of substitute products like artificial rubber, making oil from coal, and therefore reducing reliance on imports. So that's kind of a summary of what they tried to do in the four-year plan. Now, in terms of economic autokey, so economic autokey means to be self-sufficient, and it aimed to prepare the German economy for war. Now, autokey has clear links to nationalism, sovereignty, independence, and pride, and therefore it fits well into the Nazi ideology. It would free Germany from the chains of international capital. So in terms of a propaganda idea, it's very, very successful in that sense. It presents a battle in which the whole people's community had to participate. Propaganda campaigns ran, persuading people to buy German goods, eat German food, and use only German materials. It was presented almost as a patriotic duty. Now, it was also understood that full autarky would be nearly impossible to achieve. However, Göring aimed to increase Germany's production of key commodities like iron and foods. He also wanted to create substitute products called ersatz, such as Bühne, which was an artificial rubber to replace imports, and coal to make oil. Now, propaganda also encouraged people to save more, as savings would help fund investment in new production facilities. In 1937, a campaign was launched to collect scrap metal from people's homes and gardens, and even public spaces like parks, to make up for serious shortages in raw materials. So garden fences, park railings, iron lampposts were all pulled down to be melted. Pots and pans were also collected from homes by the Hitler Youth. So what was the impact of all of this? Did it actually succeed? Well, results did not match propaganda claims. It took 6 tons of coal to produce 1 ton of oil, okay? And German industry did not meet targets set by the regime. So, a statistic like this just shows how kind of pointless it was. Why are we bothering to take 6 tons of coal just to get 1 ton of German-made oil? It makes much more sense just to have imported this in at this time. Germany did not meet its targets, and by 1939, the regime still imported 1/3 of its raw materials. Now, the German economy just did not have the resources really to achieve all of the regime's aims. And by 1939, the economy is under severe strain. So what was the solution going to be? Well, by 1939, a new type of self-sufficiency was envisaged. And this was given much more stress in terms of planning and economic policy. The idea was, if we can conquer other countries, well, we can just use their resources. Fantastic. For example, Austrian iron and Russian grain. And that really became the incentive for this for the wave of kind of firstly Austria and Czechoslovakia, but then later with Blitzkrieg. This was how Germany saw themselves as being self-sufficient. So in terms of rearmament, did they achieve rearmament? Well, yes, on a surface level. Germany was quite successful at rearming itself. It marched very successfully into Austria and Czechoslovakia, and it went on to dominate in the Blitzkrieg war that followed in Eastern Europe. And, if we're looking at these successes, we have to accept there is some degree of, success in terms of rearmament. They've very easily walked in and taken over countries. By 1939, Germany is spending 1% of their GNP on the military. This increases to 17% by 1938 and 38% by 1940. This really shows, they have clearly prioritized spending on the military rather than on improving living standards for Germans themselves. Now, this kind of alludes to the tension between putting economic resources into rearmament or supplying consumer goods. Historians disagree over this debate. Originally, it's assumed that Hitler could afford to give priority to guns and neglect butter, since he was an all-powerful ruler of a repressed population. However, recently historians have challenged this view and suggested that Hitler was actually quite wary of limiting domestic consumption too far. Now, the Marxist historian Mason has argued that this need to supply both hindered the rearmament program and made Germany less prepared for war. Overy, on the other hand, has argued that the key point is to distinguish between 1933 to 1936, when public works and a revival of consumer demands were more important in economic recovery, compared to the period after 1936, when rearmament needs predominated as Hitler geared the whole economy to war. So that idea of there being a shift in focus. Firstly, it was kind of consumer demand, and then it really shifted to rearmament. And if you're evaluating effectiveness, you have to understand and evaluate based on those priorities. So, in conclusion, what does all of this mean then? The takeover of Austria and Czechoslovakia before major war broke out, during the appeasement stage of the war, when Britain and France were appeasing Germany, gave Germany very key economic resources. Now, his invasion of Poland, which led to the declaration of war from Britain and France, was very unexpected to Hitler, and what turns what he believed to have been a small war into a very major one, for which Germany actually were not prepared for. Now, his success in rearmament was really only because he was able to exploit blitzkrieg and the country's resources that he then took over. So, in that sense, we can evaluate the fact that rearmament is successful on a surface level, but it's only because they were able to exploit those other countries' resources that they were able to do so. Now, I'm going to go into the war economy in a later video, and I'm now going to go into a video in my next video about the organization of the economy. So some really good specific factual information about agriculture, industry, foreign trade, the middle stand, small businesses, things like that, how all of those precise examples works. So you can use that in your essays. And then I've got another video on the impact on living standards. So make sure you go and check those out so you really get the full picture and can get your A stars in your essays.